once again the audio-visual thing doesn't work. I can feed the HDMI cable straight into my computer, but when it goes through the recording box, I can't see the screen. I'm giving up. We're on photo booth now. So hopefully that works out as a backup should you miss a class. Okay, I wanted to talk further about evolutionarily stable strategies. And I gave a number of examples about ESS. And the last thing that I did was talk just about a number of instances in which polymorphisms are known in mating behavior in different species of animals. So this was a list compiled in like 1996. I'm sure we know more examples by now, and more work has been done certainly on some of them. So the ref, for example, is one for which we now know even the genetic basis of the male polymorphism. And I talked about the different morphs of sunfish and their frequency in Lake Affinicon. There being essentially two strategies. One of them is sort of a cuckold strategy, and the other is the parental male. The parental male, builds an excavation and pairs with the female. But sneakers or satellites will dash in and release sperm at the moment of mating, and in that way acquire fertilization. And it seems to be a polymorphism. It probably has some genetic basis. The cuckold strategy involves individuals that begin their life as sneakers, just males, and then when they become larger, become satellites, or female mimics in that case. That's a wonderful case of a polymorphism, an interesting polymorphism in nature. I also talked a little bit about the genetic basis of this. I think the genetic basis, knowing the genetic basis at least tells us something about the underlying genetic polymorphism. In this case, it's kind of a strange one because in the evolution of an inversion, which underlies the different male morphs, a gene was broken. And the result is that any individual that possesses two copies of the inversion is dead. And so two heterozygotes, a male and a female, that both possess one copy each of the original orientation and the reverse orientation, 25% of their offspring die. This would seem like a very strong selection pressure against the inversion on its own, and yet the inversion persists. And that's because there's a very large advantage to being one of these alternate male phenotypes. So understanding the ESS and the frequencies of the different morphs would make sense and know something about the underlying genetic basis. We don't have that for the sunfish. So there's, any of you interested? Go work on it. It would be fun, I guarantee. There's a last kind of polymorphism, which isn't the standard mixed ESS that I want also to cover. And there are many examples of this. I pulled one from the literature on the natterjack toad. So again, there's two male phenotypes. There are callers and there are satellites. So callers sit in the water and they call. And the females follow these sounds when time comes to mate. What satellites do is they're completely silent. and they intercept females that are sort of on their way to the calling males. And so both callers and satellites obtain some matings. In this particular study, in the UK, callers were 2/3 of the population, and satellites 1/3 of the male population. But what was observed in this case was that the callers have much higher reproductive success, mating success, than the satellites. Now, one feature of an evolutionarily stable strategy, or mixed evolutionarily stable strategy, is that at equilibrium, the fitness of all of the morphs is the same. And of course, observed matings isn't total fitness through the lifespan, but it appears that in this case here, the polymorphism is not at equilibrium. If it's a genetic polymorphism, it's far from the equilibrium. And it turns out that it's not a mixed ESS at all, but instead there's only a single strategy at work here. And it's called a conditional strategy. Apparently all males, including satellites, are structurally capable of making sounds. They don't look much different than callers, except that they're smaller. And they're not as loud when they do call. So it appears to be a conditional strategy in which, hard luck when you're a tadpole means you emerge as a relatively small male. You're more likely to become a satellite than a caller. Whereas if, you had good luck as a tadpole, got lots of food, and grew to a fairly large size when you emerged as a male, then you're a caller. So it's an if-then strategy, and the if concerns the environmental conditions that the individual experience, and it's primarily luck and not genes that determines that. So the message here is just because there's an apparent polymorphism doesn't mean it's a mixed evolutionarily stable strategy. So at one extreme would be the rough, and at the other extreme would be the natterjack toad. So many alternate male phenotypes in nature. Not all of them have a genetic basis. Some are likely to be mixed evolutionarily stable strategies, and others are likely to be conditional strategies, also called best of a bad job, is the other phrase that you'll see conditional strategies referred to in the literature. I want to tell you about one other interesting armchair game. An application of this ESS thinking to hard problems and understanding the evolution of behaviors. The game is called The Prisoner's Dilemma. Searching for the best black marker here. And a lot of thought has gone into trying to understand the evolution of cooperation. Why do organisms cooperate in nature? You see cooperation between individuals within populations. If you miss a class, you provide the notes. And the cases of cooperation include parents helping at the nest, helping their parents raise further offspring. But you'll see cooperation not just among individuals within species. You'll see cooperation also between species, like cleaner wrasse and pliant fish. So there are loads of cases in nature where cooperation occurs, many different forms. And it's been regarded as one of the hard problems in evolution. Well, the evolution of things like social insects, the extreme cases being ants and honeybees, where there are non-reproductive castes that spend their short lives, helping their mother raise more sisters rather than reproduce themselves. So these societies, these insect societies, are regarded as like the extreme cases of cooperation, where individuals even forgo their own reproduction. And in those cases, kin selection appears to be a satisfactory explanation. In cases in which honeybees, there's just a single queen who has mated just once, then worker bees are actually more closely related to their sisters than they would be to their own offspring. So kin selection can help explain why certain forms of cooperation evolve. But nature is full of examples of cooperation between non-kin. How do we understand this? One approach is to sit in an armchair for a while and think, okay, how would we try to model this and gain some understanding for how easy or how difficult it is for cooperation to evolve? And the ESS sort of approach is one of the approaches that's been used to understand this. And it's been realized that one of the most difficult payoff scenarios is one called the prisoner's dilemma. I don't know. So again, we have a payoff matrix like the hawk-dove game. And D stands for defect, and C stands for cooperate. And as usual, as in the hawk game, what we're measuring is the fitness, or some component of fitness, of either defect or cooperate when played against. And the payoffs shown here capture the game known as the prisoner's dilemma. So the game is like this. It's called the prisoner's dilemma because that's just one way in which you might imagine payoffs like this occurring. And so here's a case of potential cooperation between non-kin. Two unrelated thieves, robbers, team up to attempt to and succeed in robbing a bank, but they're captured. And so the police want to throw them in jail, and each of the individuals has, under questioning, an opportunity to keep quiet. In other words, not say anything, provide the police with no information, or alternatively, defect. And this refers to not cooperating or defecting with the police. This is each robber has a choice of whether to cooperate or defect against its partner, the other robber. So they're both held as prisoners. And the idea behind the payoff is this. So one of the individuals, they're interrogated separately. And so as I said, the prisoner under interrogation can choose to cooperate, remain silent, or defect. Just spill the beans and say what happened, and so on and so on. And the idea is that if both cooperate, so if you or you're imagining the focal individual decides to cooperate, in other words, remain silent, then if the other partner, if the partner also cooperates, then the payoff is relatively high, 3. And that's because the police won't have enough evidence, and so the sentences will be lighter. But if you decide to rat on your collaborator, you do even better. You get off scot-free or the lightest possible sentence. However, if your fellow robber defects, in other words, rats out on you, then you don't want to be cooperating because you'll go down with a long sentence. And if each of you rats on the other, then, well, things aren't that great either. But your sentence is not that great because at least you help the police a little bit. So it's not as bad as remaining quiet while your fellow robber is defecting. Okay, so this is the sort of combination of payoffs. And the reason it's thought to be such a difficult scenario for the evolution of cooperation is that there's only one evolutionarily stable strategy here, and it's mutual defection. And this is despite the fact that both of you would do better if you cooperated. So a situation in which it's beneficial to cooperate, but the only evolutionarily stable strategy is mutual defection. So the payoffs again explain this. If you cooperate, then and your partner defects, then you do the worst of all. So if your partner defects, the best thing for you to do is defect. And if your partner cooperates, the best thing for you to do is defect. And so the only possible solution is for both of you to defect. The payoff is higher no matter what your partner does to defect. So how can cooperation ever evolve in this kind of a situation? How can bank robbers ever trust one another again? So in thinking about this problem, the problem of cooperation evolution of cooperation between relatives, non-relatives, the thinking was, okay, here's a scenario in which cooperation would never evolve, pure and simple. But what if these robbers had an opportunity to rob a bank again in the future? In other words, what if it's not a one-time game? So if individuals, and humans can do this, can remember the other individual with whom they robbed the bank, and can remember what or how they behaved under this scenario, would the situation be different if they cooperated more than once, or they had the opportunity to cooperate more than once? So two individuals, Axelrod and Hamilton. So Bill Hamilton, who was an evolutionary biologist, and Axelrod, who was an economist, I believe, tried to figure out what the payoffs would be for different strategies when there's a repeated game. So this is just one iteration, but what if the whole thing was run again, and people could remember what they played the previous time and what their partner played the previous time? What then would cooperation evolve if there was more than just a single one-time opportunity to cooperate? So they decided that actually there is no mathematical solution to that problem. So they could not come up with a theory that would find the best strategy in an iterated prisoner's dilemma, a repeated prisoner's dilemma. So what they decided to do was to stage a tournament. This tournament took place on their computer. And they sent messages to all their favorite super smart people and said, look, we're going to repeat this game. Here's the payoff for a single iteration. We're going to repeat this game in a round robin. We want you to suggest the best possible strategy. And we'll compete that against all of the other strategies which are submitted and see which strategy is the best. So that rather than rely on math, which provided them with no optimal solution, they left it to smart people to come up with solutions, and then they would see which one was the best. So they did, and trying to think how many strategies they received. I didn't write that down. Anyway, dozens. And they competed them all in pairwise tournaments. And the winner overall was also the shortest code submitted by an economist named Rappaport, and it was called Tit for Tat. So the tit for tat strategy is as follows. It has two steps. Cooperate on first move. And two, thereafter, in the next game, play exactly what your opponent played or your partner played the previous iteration. So thereafter, play the move your opponent played on the previous turn. So, start out being nice. Retaliate instantly if your partner or opponent defects on you the previous time. But forgive. If your partner cooperates on, turn X, then you cooperate on the following turn. Okay, so you're quick to retaliate and quick to forgive. So, now the game became the iterated prisoner's dilemma, and it looks at the fitness of an individual playing a tit-for-tat strategy and an individual who defects. So the defector is just someone who defects on every turn. And the tit-for-tat is, this strategy here. Start out nice, retaliate instantly, forgive instantly. So the payoff matrix for an iterated game like this. I guess this would be 20 iterations of the tournament. And so the payoff for a mutual defection is just 20. No, that would be 10, right? Because the payoff is for a single round is 2. for mutual defection. What the researchers concluded is that tit for tat does a pretty good job. And in an iterated prisoner's dilemma, where you can remember the individual and what they did the last time, then there are two. I'll take that. It deserved it. That there are actually two evolutionarily stable strategies in this game. And one of them is mutual defection. In other words, if your opponent defects all the time, the best thing for you to do is defect all the time. But if your opponent plays tit for tat all the time, the best thing for you to play is tit for tat. And overall, the highest payoff of all is for individuals that are is a situation in which everybody is playing tit for tat. Now you might think, okay, well, that was fun, but what did this teach us about the evolution of cooperation? Well, to recap, the prisoner's dilemma was regarded as the worst possible payoff scenario for the evolution of cooperation, in the sense that cooperation is the best strategy overall, but it can never evolve. But they identified a situation involving repeated encounters in which cooperation can be an evolutionarily stable strategy. And this paper launched like a research enterprise, and there were several directions to this research. One was see if you can find a better strategy than tit for tat. So when the authors did this round-robin tournament, they discovered that tit for tat beat out all of the competitors. So then they wrote to all their smart friends and said, we're going to run this again. The winner was tit for tat. Submit another strategy that you think might do even better. And we'll do another round robin. So they did a second round robin. And Rappaport resubmitted tit for tat. And lots of other strategies were submitted, and they ran them all against each other, and tit for tat won the game. So tit for tat's pretty good, but it doesn't mean it's the best. It's just the best that anyone could think of. Super smart people, but you know. So there has been efforts, and you can find in the literature some additional strategies or modifications of tit for tat that I won't go into. I mean, it has some maybe unrealistic features. I'm not sure, because it requires that you can remember what your opponent did the last time, and certainly I could do that at least reasonably. I might make an error. I might forget exactly what they played the last time. But now you're asking, goldfish to do this, or birds. The question is this realistic for most creatures in nature that we know have evolved some form of cooperation? Another direction was, do organisms actually behave according to a tit-for-tat strategy? Do they play tit-for-tat, essentially? Do they retaliate? If you put them in a situation where they must cooperate and one defects, does the other retaliate on the next round? Do they forgive? I don't know. This is a computer program. Tit-for-tat is a computer code. And the question is whether animals actually behave like this, which I think is a pretty interesting one. My purpose here was really,
Can tit-for-tat invade in a three-way scenario between defect, cooperate, and tit-for-tat?
I think so, yes. I think that's correct.
Extinct defection?
So,
there's a significant advantage in the presence of tit-for-tat for cooperation.
So I think if everybody is playing defect, then tit-for-tat cannot invade. If everybody's playing tit-for-tat, then defect cannot invade. so there's still the problem of getting here. You suggested if there are 3 strategies, are there just pairwise encounters nevertheless in this 3 strategies? So I think probably the same rule would apply. Eventually, cooperate always would go extinct, I think, over repeated issues. For a while, cooperate would do all right with tit for tat, but would lose every time it encountered defect. Is cooperation? Yeah, and this. So if you think of tit for tat as a cooperative strategy, yeah, that's right. I guess I should have mentioned that. Tit for tat is kind of cooperative. It cooperates on the first move. It retaliates but forgives. And so if everyone's playing that, then that's the best thing to be. But again, is this realistic? Do organisms, even smart organisms, actually play tit for tat? Is this a reasonable model for understanding the evolution of cooperation between non-relatives in nature? So I don't know the answer to that. It's a pretty fun body of literature that investigates that. My point here was really just to, I guess, advocate for an armchair approach as part of the effort to understand things like the evolution of cooperation, to just sit down and think about potential payoffs and then learn something about how, in the one case, it's so difficult to understand how cooperation has evolved. We all we live in cooperative societies, and we all realize that there are other models for cooperation. So how many of you have ever purchased something on Amazon? So you paid your money before you got the goods. So you're trusting Amazon to actually send you the stuff. And they do. So you can think of that as a form of cooperation between non-relatives. You're not actually simultaneously trading money for object. You have to trust that this package is going to arrive. What happens if it doesn't? You write a nasty review online, right? So there's a situation in which reputation matters, and so you can imagine that certainly in a complicated society like ourselves, that reputation also becomes one way in which cooperation might evolve. If everybody keeps score on whether you defect or cooperate. So if everybody knows the defector, then they just go down, and that's a different game entirely. But again, it's just fun to think about how cooperation evolved in nature and whether any of these scenarios are the best way to understand. And there have been some tests of tit for tat in fish and so on. Yeah, that's a good question. I'm trying to think of it in terms of a client fish and a cleaner fish. So,
symbiotic relationships would be the same thing here. So that's kind of good.
So,
mutualism.
Yeah,
That's my tip for that.
It's a good question. Symbiotic relationship. So a symbiotic relationship is an interaction that is very intimate, like one organism living inside another, and then they can cooperate or not. Often in such cases, the organism that lives inside the cytoplasm might provide a vitamin that the other needs. You end up with the evolution of these obligate mutualisms. Yeah, it's all a very good question. So mutualism is another way, another payoff matrix in which there's an immediate benefit to cooperation. That's not the prisoner's dilemma. That's an easy situation for understanding the evolution of cooperation. In the case of a client fish and a wrasse, so here's the case of two species that interact. They probably interact repeatedly. These client fish, move to these stations repeatedly. They'll go off and then they'll come back. Can they remember what the cleaner wrasse did the last time they were there? Did it actually remove parasites, or did it take a chunk of flesh out of the side? And because there's such a thing as a fang. Have you ever heard of a fang blenny? Fang blenny is a mimic of a cleaner wrasse. It has a similar color pattern. It tends to be a cleaner wrasse and swims up to the fish and takes a bite out of the side. Nature is pretty harsh. Just telling you. And then there's the flip side too of the cleaner wrasse. Am I going to go into that mouth and remove parasites off the inside? And you see this fish opens mouth, or crocodile opens mouth, and bird or cleaner wrasse goes in, and you just think, what is that client fish thinking? It's got this fish already in its mouth, and it doesn't actually chomp down on it. How does that evolve? It's pretty interesting to think about. That ends the ESS chapter, and as usual, I have some example exam questions, so you can look at those when you download the PDF file. I forgot my watch today, so I don't know what time it is. 10:12. Okay, I can start the next chapter. Optimal foraging. So the optimal foraging continues kind of this line of thinking in that we're going to try to think about the problem of an organism in its environment, looking for food and asking, what's the best way of going about it? So the approach uses this optimization approach, and really we've already encountered it in the ESS literature and thinking about tit for tat. We're asking, okay, here's the payoff, what's the best thing to do? And in the context of organisms looking for food in their environment, we're going to start by avoiding important questions like, well, what do they actually eat? And where do they eat? And instead we're going to put another log on the fire, and we're going to sit in our cushy chair, and then we're going to ask, well, wait a minute. Before we even go out there into nature and see what organisms do, let's ask first, what should they be doing? What should they eat? Where should they feed? And I want to show you some of the insights that have come from this approach. You can judge yourself whether the approach is useful or effective. It's based on the idea that we justify using the optimization approach because we imagine that natural selection kind of does that. If there's a population of organisms that vary in how they go about looking for food, then natural selection will favor the best strategy over time. And this literature doesn't really go as deep as asking what the genetic basis might be of these behaviors. It's really just based entirely on phenotypes. And imagining what phenotypes would do, strategies, and then imagining that natural selection would favor the best phenotype eventually over time. And when the approach was sort of first developed, and this is going back to the 60s, there was a lot of controversy because the people thought that it meant that natural selection would produce a perfect being. And it's not really true. I mean, for me, an optimal forager is someone who goes out and does it for me. That doesn't happen. Instead, the idea is that natural selection is going to produce, over time, the best phenotype, given whatever the constraints are. And so those constraints are sometimes, but not always, specified. And so in thinking about what's optimized, the currency in the background is fitness, but to make progress, what people usually try to model based on different behavioral strategies for foraging is energy gain per unit time or growth rate, something like that. Yeah, we got a bunch of things to write on the board, but it's going to take. I think we only have about 5 minutes left. Is that correct? Can you just tell me? I don't have enough time to actually go through this optimal diet, but I'm going to go through this paper a little bit. MacArthur and Pianka, 66, and they asked, what should a predator eat if it's out there foraging? And to do that, they had to say, okay, well, what are the parameters of the environment in which this animal is searching for food? And the first thing he said is, okay, let's start with a bunch of simplifying assumptions. First, let's assume that when the predator is looking for prey and that it encounters those prey items randomly in the environment, it's almost blind. It just walks around, and if it bumps into a prey item, then it has to decide, has to make a decision. And it bumps into the different kinds of items that are out there randomly. We know that's not true, but let's just take it for now. The second is we're going to assume that the currency that's maximized is energy gain per unit time. The third thing is that all of the different prey types that are out there actually have the same energy content, they just differ in their handling time, how long it actually takes to consume them. And that handling time could be, actually subduing them or swallowing them or processing them or something like that. And this assumption doesn't matter that much. Like, they don't have to be of equal energy content. It's going to make my explanation of it easier. The next assumption is that we're going to assume that all the different types of prey items out there have the same nutritional content. So we're not talking about, a plant that gets nutrients and sunlight, and the absence of one can't be made up for by the more of the other. So the foods are substitutable nutritionally. Another simplifying strategy. And then I'll show you how when we model it, the cost of foraging is not energy, but time. And total time is spent both searching and handling. And so what they said, what they tried to do is say, in this circumstance, how do we expect organisms to behave? And I'll show you next time what those expectations are. And they're a little bit intuitive once you've heard them, but surprisingly informative, I will argue.